Let's start with, Eric, with you. Your background is first and foremost as a mathematician.
Yes.
You were not actually started as a biologist, you started as a mathematician. And of course, now you're one of the most successful biologists ever. What happened in the data world in biology as you grew up in it?
Yeah, the data world in biology, it's pretty easy to describe what it looked like in the early 1980s when I first got involved in biology, which was there was no data world. The Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research, which is where I had my first position in biology, when they were planning the building and building it in 1983, it had no provision for a computer room anywhere in the building. At the last minute, just before they were going to move in, they built a computer room because they thought that a computer might be useful.
What did they do instead?
Well, I mean, all data was stored in your notebook. If it was important data, you wrote it down, and it was in your notebook, and the thought that I might want data in your notebook, I might go down the hall and talk to you and get some data from your notebook. But within 7 years or so, by 1990, the Human Genome Project got launched. And so I was involved in this Human Genome Project, and from 1990 to 2003, the whole world worked together to read out one human genome, that is the 3 billion letters of one person's DNA. And that took 13 years, and we spent $3 billion doing that. And the thought that we were going to do a whole lot more of those was not particularly in our mind at the beginning because it was $3 billion.
It's the 3 billion for one.
3 billion for, so 3 billion letters of DNA for $3 billion.
Okay.
Such a deal.
Can I buy a vowel?
Sorry?
Can I buy a vowel?
Can you buy a vowel? Yes. You can get an A. It's the only vowel we've got in the 4-letter code of DNA. But it's gotten a lot cheaper to get an A because in the 15 years since we finished the Human Genome Project, the cost of sequencing DNA has fallen by about 4 million-fold. That's 3 times faster than Moore's Law. And it means that just at the Broad Institute that I direct, just at the Broad alone, we sequence one new human genome coming off the line every 9 minutes. And we do it for about $800. So we recently passed the 100,000 whole genomes and a lot more partial scans of genomes. Worldwide, there might be 500,000 genomes, and it's going up and up and up. It's just stunning the rate at which we generate data. So for a field where you didn't even think you'd have a computer room, today at a biomedical research institute, we have hundreds of people in our data science platform who do things that you would recognize here in Silicon Valley. And so it's just the biggest shift you can imagine. You can't be a biologist today without data.
Now, Jeff, you are obsessed at the moment about the retina, and in particular something called the fundus. Why are you obsessed, literally, with retina?
Right. So I think the reason we're obsessed is there's actually been a lot of fundamental advances in general purpose computer vision. So we've gone from basically not being able to see very well with computers to being able to see very well. And this has broad implications across a whole range of different industries, because if you think back to the time that animals evolved eyes, we're sort of now at that point in computing. Computers can now see and understand the world around them. And one of the fields that this has major implications for is in various kinds of medical imaging problems. Because now we can actually train machine learning models to take, for example, in ophthalmology, a fundus image, which is a picture of the back of your retina, and then make an assessment of whether that retina shows symptoms of a disease called diabetic retinopathy, which is the fastest growing cause of blindness in the world. There's about 400 million people at risk for this around the world, many in sort of countries without very many ophthalmologists. And we now have machine learning models that not only are as good as board-certified ophthalmologists, but in more recent work, we've gotten them to be as good as retinal specialists at diagnosing this kind of disease. And we think that's just an example of the kind of implications that we'll have for using machine learning in healthcare.
But you had a recent result that was striking to me, where you could look into somebody's eye and predict whether they smoked or not, right? Their
right.
sex. it looks like you can predict the quality of their heart health with this exam.
Yeah.
People are excited that you'll be able to offer a tool to a cardiologist. Number one cause of death worldwide is heart disease of one kind or another. You can literally tell how they're doing in their eye.
Right. So it's actually super interesting. The assessing diabetic retinopathy is something ophthalmologists know how to do given time and looking at an image. What's interesting is I will tell you a bit of a story of scientific discovery. So Lily Peng, who heads up the diabetic retinopathy machine learning work we've been doing, we had a new person join the software team, and we have a software pipeline to train machine learning models from retinal images to different things. And she said, oh, this new person, why don't you go off and see if you can train a model to predict age and gender from the retinal image? She thought that they wouldn't be able to predict gender at all because ophthalmologists don't really know how to predict gender. But it would at least tell if the pipeline was working. And so she said, well, go off and come back when you've done that. And the person came back and said, OK, I've done that, and I can predict gender with 75% accuracy. And Lily said, no, that can't be right. Why don't you go off and check everything and come back when you've really checked it? And so they came back, and they said, OK, now I can do it with 90% accuracy. So that really led the team to say, hey, maybe there's more information in the retinal images than we really thought there was. And so they went off and started to predict a whole bunch of other things that are all sort of things that you might want to be able to predict that are indicators of your cardiovascular health. And so now we have kind of a combination of things that we can look for in the retinal image that actually allow us to assess cardiovascular health to the same level of accuracy as a more traditional, like draw blood, send the blood away to the lab, wait hours or days, get the lab test back.
It's best illustrated by, I'll pick some diseases and sort of tell you what's happened because of large amounts of data. Schizophrenia, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and say generally cell biology in general. Schizophrenia. If you go back 7 years ago, the number of genes that we knew that definitively played a role in schizophrenia was approximately 0. We knew nothing. Today, that number is in over 200 genes that are definitively known to play a role in schizophrenia. And none of it came from prior biological hypotheses. It came because people collected 120,000 people with and without schizophrenia and looked at them for millions of genetic variants and started building models and correlating and validating. And in this way, we now have this list of 200 genes, and we don't understand what most of them do, but some of them we do. Number 1 on the list, it's involved in pruning the synaptic connections in the brain. And by the way, number 6 on the list is also involved. So suddenly we know that this disease involves that process. And now people are all turning their guns on the list and figuring out what do all these things do. So it's true for many inherited diseases that rather than knowing a lot, having prior hypotheses, asking the data is the best way to go. This is also turning out to be the case in cancer. We thought in the 1980s and 90s that we knew what the genes that cause cancer were about. They had played roles in certain signaling pathways in the cell. Well, that's true, but it turned out there were vast classes of genes we were missing. And if you looked at a lot of tumors and you read out their whole DNA and you started correlating where the mutations were, you could find whole new classes of genes based on those mutations. And those have implications for which patients respond to which medicines. Because it turns out the patients that respond to particular anti-cancer drugs often have particular mutations. Lung cancer is a great example, but there are many examples like that.
We now have machine learning algorithms that are actually very good at sequential prediction kinds of tasks. Which, given a patient here, are they likely to develop diabetes? Or are they, are they at high mortality risk right now?
So this goes back to this key thing that AI can do, which is predicting the next thing based on a history. So if I were to check into the hospital, they can probably predict what will happen next to me.
Right.
That will really help them.
Yeah. So essentially, the way I would view these models is if you have a healthcare system and medical records with, 100,000 medical doctor years of wisdom instilled in those decisions that are recorded in the medical record. You want those medical decisions to inform every doctor in the healthcare system so that they can make better decisions, so they can get like an instant second opinion or advice about these sorts of things. And we now have the capability with machine learning to make it so you can distill your 20,000 doctor colleagues into a tool for you.
So put your research hat on as opposed to your product hat. What are the researching things that you're doing in your research job that could ultimately lead to transformative products in this area? I know, for example, you're working in voice, right? The notion of voice transcription to help the doctors out.
Yeah, as you called out, one of the big stresses for doctors today is the way we've gone to electronic medical records, unfortunately, involves them doing a lot of sort of manual entry of data that ultimately goes into the EMR, and that's like additional work where they're not actually caring for patients. It's just kind of a documentation thing. That is the richness of data that is there, so it's great to have that data there. But we think you could use speech recognition, which now works much better, automatic summarization techniques that would allow you to go from a conversation between a doctor and a patient to a draft of the kind of information you'd actually want to enter into the medical note that would relieve doctors of a lot of the sort of documentation burden that they have today. And you'd also then probably get richer and more interesting information into the medical record.